The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm Paula Alsher, Vice President of Client Solutions for IMA, Implementation Management Associates. And I want to welcome you to our session where we're going to be talking about what it takes to lead people through business changes in the real world. Our main presenter is Don Harrison, President and founder of IMA and developer of the industry standard Accelerating Implementation Methodology, better known to many of you as AIM. Some of you I know have had the opportunity to work with Don, and you know firsthand his expertise in dealing with the messy and difficult reality of implementation in organizations. Over the past 35-some years, Don's worked with organizations around the world to help them successfully implement large-scale and complex changes. For Don, this work has essentially served as really a continuous field research effort, and it's enabled him to identify a set of best practices for implementing business changes, and we're going to be talking about some of those today. And I might add, if you want someone who knows what it takes to get what you need from your sponsors, then Don is definitely your guy. Don's going to cover a lot of ground in the time we have together. If you've been on past webinars, you know they're pretty content-rich. Many of you are going to want to have a copy of our slide deck, and if you're on the call today, you'll automatically get a link to both the deck and the recorded version, so you can listen again on demand if you'd like in an email that you'll get in the next day or so. As you have questions today, please do go ahead and type them in under the questions section of your GoToWebinar toolbar. We're going to save about 10 minutes at the end to answer as many questions as we can possibly answer. And we'll also be addressing some of the questions you submitted when you registered. And there were some great ones. We really appreciate your taking the time to send those to us. Also, at the end of the session today, you'll see a few questions where we ask you for your feedback and suggestions, and we'll have a chance to answer for any kind of specific follow-up that's of interest to you. So let's just jump right into our topic. And I got this cartoon yesterday, and I just thought, wow, this is so perfect. I need to share it. Obviously, this is not what we're going to be talking about as a best practice for leading people through business changes, but I think a lot of the people that we work with in organizations today feel like they have been thrown off a cliff. We're going to talk about some ways to make that happen, avoid having that happen, and make implementation go a little bit better. So just as some context for the session today, you know, I said Don's been working for a long time in organizations, and I think over the years we've seen project management improve enormously over that period of time. There's a lot more attention being paid today in managing the technical elements of projects. But what we still don't have universally is the level of purposeful approach, the discipline, and the rigor on the human side of the change, and yet we know these human and cultural elements carry enormous risks. And Don, I'd just be interested in a quick comment from you about your observations from the time you spend in organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Paula. You know, we see so many organizations who do have discipline on the technical side and the financial side, but for some reason have not applied that same level of discipline to the human and business elements of change, and as a result, many of their projects are going to fail before they get started because they don't have the proper foundation. So there are many change management methodologies out there that focus on the impacts of change on the individual or the interpersonal or even the intergroup aspects of implementation. But in truly order to be able to maximize and accelerate implementation, there is a discipline that has to be applied to the human side of any implementation, just like we'd apply it to the financial or the technical side.
Yeah, I think that leads us to really, it's a great segue to our agenda for today, where we are going to be talking about the value of a structured process. Don's going to cover some of the critical factors for success, talking about defining the change, sponsorship, readiness, reinforcements for change, and targeted communications. And then, as I said, we're going to spend some time on questions and discussions. So Don, I think we're ready to get started, and I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's get started.
Thanks, Paul. Well, welcome, everyone. The first thing we have to do is start with a couple of foundational pieces, which are definitions, and we need to be able to define what successful implementation is. And it's at this point that the lack of discipline will come home to haunt you if you don't have this foundation built. We know that many projects will fail simply because they're poor or ill-defined to start with. Now, I know this doesn't sound like anything earth-shattering, or this is not, as one of my clients said, this is not rocket surgery, but most projects will fail in implementation because they don't have successful implementation defined. And successful implementation is defined by any project that we deem to be successful occurs on time, it occurs on budget, and obviously accomplishes the technical objectives of the change. However, if any definition stops at that point, what you'll get as a result is installation of the new technology, the new process, or the new structure. Two other things must be defined for your project to be successful, and that is we must be able to define the business objectives of the change and the human objectives of the change. Unfortunately, this is very difficult to build reverse, and we know that many organizations will not devote the requisite discipline to defining a change right up front. Now, the only thing you can define when it comes to human beings on a daily basis in your organization is behavior. You can define, that is the only thing you can measure. You can measure productivity, effectiveness, efficiency over time, but the only thing you can measure on a daily basis when it comes to projects in your organization is that which is observable, and that is behavior. That means in order to define your project successfully and to be able to meet that success criteria, you must define your project in terms of the behaviors you seek to see for each separate target group. Now, this is not some warm and fuzzy output, folks. What we're looking to be able to do is match the reinforcement specifically to the behavior. For any reinforcement to have its most significant impact, it must immediately follow on the heels of the behavior. So if you do not define your project in terms of the behaviors you seek to see, managers have no capacity to apply the reinforcement to the behavior, and we have lost the power for acceleration. So the human objectives must be defined in terms of the behaviors we seek to see when success is achieved. So on time, on budget, technical objectives of the change, business objectives of the change, human objectives of the change. I can come back and give you 100 examples of where I've gone into organizations with projects that are struggling, and the major reason in our process is the key roles in implementation. And our cast of characters involves 4 critical roles in the change process, and we're going to be using these terms for the rest of the presentation. There are 4 critical roles in the implementation process. Number 1 is that of the change champions. Champions are anybody who believes in a change and is attempting to obtain sponsorship for it. So any of the other 3 roles can, in some cases, must be champions. So being a champion of change is somebody who believes in it and is attempting to obtain sponsorship for it. Next role, easy to understand, agents. Agents have implementation responsibility. That means if not all, at least part of their performance is being evaluated and reinforced on how well this project gets done. So most changes will have multiple agents. The most important role, sponsors. Sponsors possess enough organizational power and or influence to either authorize the change, sign the check and get it moving, or reinforce it at the local level. Those are all sponsors of change, and we're going to give you some more definition around that. But the lead into this is to understand that major changes will have multiple sponsors. We go into many, many organizations where sponsors are appointed or anointed or assigned to a project. And the other thing you're going to find from us this morning is that sponsorship is a very, very active condition. It is an active condition of reinforcing, communicating, and demonstrating the change in the organization. and it is not signing a check or even chairing a committee. So we'll look at sponsors of change, and there has to be a sponsor of change at every management level. Now, the last role is easiest of all to understand, and that is the targets. Targets have to change the logistics, economics, politics, power, whatever. Now, we can also come back and tell you that sponsorship, after we've defined these roles, sponsorship is the single most important factor ensuring fast and successful implementation. It is sponsored drive that controls the pace of implementation. It is not change agent frenetic activity that controls the pace. It is sponsor drive. So when sponsors come back to me and complain that their changes are not going fast enough, then my response to them is, what are you going to do differently to drive the change? So, and we'll give you some more examples of sponsorship in just a few minutes. So outlined in the next slide is the basic AIM roadmap and how we're going to fit these definitions into the AIM roadmap. So you can see that the AIM roadmap, the accelerating implementation methodology, is made up of 10 steps. Now, the last thing I want you to do when you look at this diagram is to think that if you did 10 linear steps in sequence, your implementation would be done. First of all, to understand that change is a non-linear process. It is cyclical. It is iterative. Also, the train doesn't stop while we're trying to repair it. Things keep moving forward. So some of this stuff will have to be done more than once. Some of these things may have to be done continuously. Much will have to be done concurrently. So the way I want you to think about the AIM roadmap is to think about it like all the idiot gauges and the idiot lights and the gauges on the dashboard of your car. So it doesn't matter whether you're about to start your implementation engine up, you're in planning, or you're in the middle of implementation, your engine is running, or you're about to shut it off, you're in monitoring. This will always give you a picture of how your implementation engine is going. Now, just like in your car, not all these things are created equal. So at the top of the page, you'll have one we just talked about, define the change. This is the anchor. This is the foundation for all this to make it go more quickly. So if the requisite rigor is not used in defining the change, no amount of our activity around the rest of this will have its most significant impact. So just like in your car, not all these things are created equal. So when the windshield washer fluid light goes on, you can wait a while to deal with that. But when the oil light goes on, you've got to deal with that right away. So we have to be able to take a look at this and think in terms of where we're going to be able to have the pressure, where we're going to have the target points, where we're going to have the pressure points in the organization. So for those of you unfamiliar to the methodology, let me say something that is very important in looking at AIM. The goal of the AIM methodology is to not do the complete methodology. The goal of AIM is to know what to do. So if you do this work in the real world, and I know that many of you do, the first thing you'll come to grips with is you will never have the full complement of resources you believe necessary to implement the change. No change occurs in isolation. There are all other kinds of things competing for the same resources at the same time. Sponsors want to pay the least price possible for any implementation, and as a result, we will never have that full load, that perfect load to implement the change perfectly. Given that we will never have that full load of resources because of competition for resources and because of the sponsor's perception of trying to pay the least price possible, we have to be able to target our scarce resources to have maximum impact in the shortest amount of time. And that's what the AIM roadmap does. It doesn't matter where you are in the implementation process. It will show you where do you target your resources to have more impact in less time. So for example, we just talked about define the change as a requisite foundation point. Let's go down to the right-hand side of the page and talk about sponsorship. Well, we just alluded to the fact that sponsorship is the single most important factor in ensuring successful implementation. If I had to give you a mathematical equivalent, we can actually do that because we built an algorithm for this methodology with people from MIT. Sponsorship is as much as 30 to 50% of the battle. Well, what does that mean for us out there? Well, it means even if you have the world's very best new technology or very best new process, if it's poorly driven by the sponsors in the organization, and we'll show you what the behavior sponsors have to demonstrate, if it's poorly driven by sponsorship or not driven with enough force by sponsorship, it has about a 1 in 2 likelihood for success. Go down to the bottom of the page. Develop target readiness. Very critical one. that we're going to talk a little bit of in this session. Two things you should take away from this session. Number one, that resistance is inevitable and is not necessarily logical. Or what's logical to you is not necessarily logical to everybody else. Now, I know that many of you will spend nights awake trying to come up with one magical explanation that will make everybody like your change and make the resistance go away. And my advice is go to sleep, because that explanation does not exist. Let's move over to everybody's favorite whipping boy here, communication planning. I've never worked on a project yet where somebody said we didn't need better communications, but nobody's ever been able to tell me what that looked like. The first thing you have to understand is that a communication plan is not an implementation plan. In fact, what you're going to find out today is that if all we do is communicate, we're actually going to generate more resistance. So communication must be cyclical, it must be iterative, it must be in the frame of reference and the language of the target group you're trying to impact. So we're going to have multiple vehicles, multiple languages to communicate. And it doesn't matter how well you do that, if you move up to the light blue box on the right side, if you don't change the reinforcement, you don't get the change. So I don't have any simpler way to say that, folks. You can't continue to reinforce the same old values and behaviors and expect to get change in your organization. So we're going to focus on these boxes today in our presentation. So when we define the human objectives and behaviors we seek to see, that means there will be different behaviors for different target groups, which requires implementation of specific measures per target group. Now, so if we take that as a natural follow-on, then communication must be in the language and frame of reference of that target group. Reinforcement must be able to address what's in it for them and what it means to them. So we have to get really specific and disciplined down to each and individual target group impacted by the change. Now, what happens if an implementation fails? Well, we're going to allude to the history of implementation here. When we say failure, let's go back to our definition of what successful change is. So a failure to us is a project that did not occur on time, or did not occur on budget, or missed the technical, business, or human objectives of the change, or some combination of those things. Every time a change fails to meet its stated objectives, we're going to pay some prices. Short and long-term prices, direct and indirect prices. Now, most managers, most of you as managers out there, are going to focus almost exclusively on the upper quadrant, the wasted resources. However, that is not the most significant cost. The most significant cost you will pay every time a change fails to meet its stated objectives is in this lower quadrant. The most significant cost you will pay is you will teach your organization as a management structure you don't know what the hell you're doing. It teaches them to have lower confidence in leadership. As a result, resistance to change increases, and future changes are more likely to be slower to implement. Now, we talked about readiness and resistance in our opening remarks, but let's be very, very clear. Why do we manage resistance? Why do we have to allocate resources to manage resistance? If you can buy into the basic premise that resistance is inevitable and we want to implement at speed, then we're going to have to allocate resources to manage the resistance. In fact, the faster we want to implement, the more resources are going to be consumed in managing the resistance. So the reasons we manage resistance are not necessarily around making people feel better. That would be an admirable outcome, but not possible all the time. The reasons we allocate resources to managing resistance is because we want the change to implement at speed. So that's the first reason. However, if we, based on this 2x2 matrix, if we don't manage the resistance to the first change, confidence goes down, and it impacts speed of all subsequent change. So we've impacted overall speed. So the reasons we manage resistance are, number one, to increase the speed of implementation on this project. Number two, we manage resistance to increase overall speed on all subsequent projects. And number three, we know that you can't treat your employees you can't treat your customers any better than you treat yourselves. And so that if we don't manage it inside, it's going to be reflected outside in our customer base. So let's put this in a really very simple context for you. Over the years at IMA, we have studied thousands of factors and their influence on implementation, and we've been able to break those factors down into two broad categories, what we call implementation climate factors and what we call organizational readiness factors. Now, I know that most of you out there do some kind of annual employee morale engagement surveys and all that kind of stuff. Typically, those surveys have multiple factors in them. Of all that stuff that you're looking at in the organization, two things have the most significant impact in the climate on whether your implementation will be successful or not. One is the stress level. So no change occurs in isolation. It occurs in the context of all the other things competing for resources at the same time and their cumulative impact. And don't forget their cumulative impact. And the other part of that context is no change occurs in isolation. It occurs in the context of all the lessons previously learned around implementation based on our 2x2 matrix we just looked at. So every change that you're about to approach goes into this dual context of everything competing for resources and all the lessons previously learned. So that is the context, the climate in which we throw our change. However, the places where we're going to have the most significant impact is on four very simple factors. Sponsor capacity, that's a resource commitment, communication, and reinforcement of people in power and authority. Target readiness, how we communicate and reinforce the target's surface and manage the resistance. Cultural fit, to what degree does it fit with the culture and what degree not. And agent capacity, what are the skills, relationships, and abilities of people who have implementation responsibility. All four of those things are critical. Sponsor capacity is the most impactful. All four are critical. The least impactful is agent capacity. What does that mean? Even if we assign the very best people to a project as change agents, if they cannot orchestrate the sponsorship, impact the target readiness, and the cultural fit, it is still going to fail no matter how sound it is technically. This is also another indication that sponsors control the pace of implementation. It is not agent activity that controls the pace. It is sponsor drive that controls the pace of implementation. Now, why do we look at the climate at all? Well, this is a pretty simple bottom line hydraulic. The more problematic your climate, the more resources it's going to take to create readiness. The less problematic your climate, the less resources it's going to take to create readiness. So the only reason we look at the climate at all is to give us an idea of the relative load it's going to take to create readiness in the organization. Implementation is a ferociously resource-consuming activity. It'll consume far more resources to implement the thing than it ever will be to design it or even buy the equipment or do the training. Implementation is a major resource consumption in organizations. Well, we better go back and talk, since sponsors are the single most important factor in ensuring successful implementation. We better talk about what sponsors actually have to do. So we talked earlier about that sponsorship is a very active condition. Sponsorship is action and position. Now, I'm going to put this in a very simple context and take it out of sponsorship just for a minute so people get an understanding around it. Back in, I think, 1979, 1980, there was a book written by Tom Peters et al. Called In Search of Excellence. Some of you may have heard of it. But he talked about the need for all organizations to be values-driven. Well, guess what? All organizations are values-driven. It's just, are you driven by the values that are going to make you successful or not? But you don't really have one set of values. You have three different sets of values, or at least three different ways those values are manifest. So we have values expressed. This is the written and verbal communications we see on the part of the organization. Values modeled or demonstrated. This is the observable behaviors we see on the part of executives and managers, and values reinforced. And the most powerful set of values you will have in your organization are those values that are reinforced. Now, this leads us back to some very basic tenets about reinforcement. First of all, every time you see a pattern of behavior replicated over and over again somewhere in an organization, somewhere there is or was a reward for that behavior. There is no such thing as behavior in isolation. People just don't wake up in the morning and say they're going to be really devious at work. When we see these behaviors replicated over and over again, there are formal or informal rewards. So, for example, if you have turf guarding in your organization, hypothetically, if you have turf guarding, it's there because it is or was rewarded. It's there because it works. So the most powerful set of values we have here of these three is reinforced. Now, the more closely aligned these three sets of values, the easier it is for the organization to change, the faster the organization becomes. And I'll give an example. One of my previous clients, from the olden days, and they say never to do this in the business books, but their express value was profit. They used to literally say to their employees, you're going to come to work here for 4 or 5 years. We are going to burn you out and throw you away. The likelihood is 20 to 1 you'll still be here 5 years from now. What they modeled was profit. If it came down to a choice between me going to a 4-day AIM accreditation and making my numbers, I was going to make my numbers. And what they reinforced was profit. Make your numbers, make big bucks. Now, it may be morally abhorrent as a place you'd like to go work, but it was real easy to figure out what was expected of you in this organization. Let's take another example from one of the olden days of one of my largest clients, and their express value is quality. Quality, 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 right? We have seen the light, and his name is Deming. What they modeled was political acumen. If it came down to a choice between me doing a total quality job and keeping my boss happy, I was going to keep my boss happy. And what they reinforced was cost containment. Now, so you get a tremendous non-alignment between these 3 sets of values. Now, when you get this non-alignment between these 3 sets of values, the trust goes down in the organization. This is one of the fundamental trust anchors in any organization. I have high degrees of trust if what you say is what you do is what you reinforce. So when the trust goes down, the speed goes down. Why? Well, if I have a low trust organization, what happens every time I introduce a major change? Well, we get higher degrees of resistance. Higher degrees of resistance means the change is going to cost us more and it's going to take us longer. So trust and speed are functional, even at the individual level. If I have a sponsor that I trust and the sponsor trusts me as his change agent, we can work very, very quickly with low structure. I'm going to trust that he's going to do his sponsor stuff. He's going to trust that I'm going to do my agent stuff, and we can work very, very quickly. But if the sponsors and agents don't trust each other, that means we're going to have many more check-in points, many more decision points, many more structural points, many more contracting points. So even at the individual level, trust and speed are functional. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, this is what sponsorship truly is. What do good sponsors do? They express their commitment to the change. So even the expressed is not some tacit pass-through the need for the change. It is publicly and privately expressing their commitment to the change. What do good sponsors do? They model the change. That means they change their own behavior in a visible way to demonstrate the change or its importance, either through their own behavior or through resource allocation or prioritization. What do good sponsors do? They reinforce the change. That means they change the rewards and consequences for their direct reports. And once again, these things are not created equal. What a sponsor says expressed is critical, X. What a sponsor does in their own behavior is twice as important as what they say. What a sponsor reinforces is 3 times as important as what they say. So we get fast, effective change when what sponsors say, do, and reinforce are completely in alignment. So sponsorship is a very active condition. It is an active condition of expressing, modeling, and reinforcing their commitment to the change. But let's talk about what has to happen here. What we see on slide 14 is a common scenario. And I've used to do this in my own organization. I used to go home on Saturdays and Sundays and pick up all sorts of wonderful stuff for my organization to do. And I'd come back in on Monday mornings and throw my thunderbolts down from the mountain, and I expect everybody to change. Well, I'd come out of my office at 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, not a thing. And the reason is this. Who do I have the most impact on? Well, my direct reports. So if I, as the authorizing sponsor of the change, the person who starts this change, signs the check and get it moving, if I just send my messages and out to the troops and expect them to change, they're not going to change. Why? Because there's no circuitry in here. Communication and reinforcement must cascade level by management level down the organization. So when we say sponsorship is the single most important factor in ensuring successful implementation, we're not saying any one sponsor is the single most important factor. We're saying this cascading network of expressed, modeled, and reinforced commitment level by level between the authorizing sponsor and the ultimate targets of the change. That also should lead you to a very important conclusion, and that very important conclusion is that I can only sponsor something in my part of the organization that I control. So, for example, HR cannot sponsor anything into the line organizations. IT is only the sponsor for things within the IT organizations. Both IT and HR in those previous examples are champions to the rest of the organization and must require sponsorship in each separate power structure in the organization. So many times we go into organizations and find sponsors who are appointed or anointed and do not have control or impact on the organizations that are directly impacted. That is a recipe for failure. Every organization that is directly impacted must have a sponsorship structure. Now, everything we do must be done from the sponsor's motivation. What is the sponsor's universal motivation? Well, they want everything to go fast, they want it to go cheap, and they want it to go to the highest quality. So if what you're doing with sponsors is not showing them how it's going to go faster, or cheaper, or better, you will never get the sponsorship that you need. The second thing is that we have to understand something very simple. If I went to Paris and I wanted to be understood at the highest possible level, I would speak French. If you go to sponsor land, what language should you speak? You should not be speaking change management or project management or IT. You should be speaking sponsor language. You must be in the language and motivation of the sponsors to get what you need out of sponsorship in the organization. We must be able to identify how what we're doing exploits an opportunity, meets a defined need, reduces discomfort, or eliminates pain, number one, for that sponsor personally, number two, for their specific organization, and number three, for the overall organization. So we're moving from individual to systemic motivations with the authorizing sponsors when we're trying to get them on board. So we must identify the benefits of their specific organization, them personally. We must understand the disruption from the sponsor's frame of reference, and to get sponsors on board, we have to treat them as targets of the change first, meaning we have to surface and manage their concerns and risks from their frame of reference to be able to get them engaged in the project. Well, we need to come back and revisit our basic aim roadmap and come back and think in terms of what it really takes and what really happens in organizations. And there are so many misconceptions about where resistance comes from. So we might as well make sure that everybody on this broadcast has got that cleared up. This is my attempt on this slide 18, to draw a carpenter's spirit level. That's what that thing is in the middle of the page. Now, all organizations, in fact, all organisms attempt to reach a state of equilibrium. Why? Well, we as human beings have such needs for predictability that we know that many of us will stay in negative situations simply because it's predictable and known. So it's the only way I can explain why people stay in bad jobs or bad marriages, or I used to do some work with women who had been battered by their husbands. It is not the desired state that keeps many people from moving. It is the first few steps into the unknown that keeps many people from moving. So resistance is not a function of liking, understanding the change. So the interesting thing we found with change in organizations is, well, let's try and change our organization. Let's focus on the left-hand side. Well, it's a no-brainer to figure out, I'm trying to change you, you dislike it, and think of it as a negative change, I'm going to generate resistance. But a very interesting thing happens with change in organizations. It does not matter whether the change is perceived of as positive or negative. That is not what generates resistance. Resistance is a function of disruption. What does that mean? Even if people like the change, if it represents a significant disruption to either establish behavior patterns, habit patterns, reinforcement patterns, value patterns, relationship patterns, it is still going to generate resistance. Some of the most resisted projects we've ever worked on were actually liked by the organization, whether it be new technology or quality or those kind of things, Six Sigma. All those represent significant disruptions from established behavior patterns, and they're going to generate significant resistance. So for the questions out there for people who are doing enterprise-wide change and want a systemic view of it, The questions are not whether you will or will not have resistance. The questions are how much, how am I going to pay for it, and how am I going to manage it. Because resistance is a resource-consuming activity. Managing resistance is a resource-consuming activity. So we have to allocate resources to manage the resistance. The faster we want to implement, the more resources to manage the resistance. So resistance to major change is, in fact, inevitable. And it's not necessarily logical. Or what's logical to you is not logical to the people in the organization. So on slide 19, you'll see a very simple model that shows us how we get resistance to a positive change. This model only has predictive value for you if people initially like the change. We have a whole different model if people dislike the change or feel it's outside of their control. Now, on the left axis, we have confidence. On the horizontal axis, we have time. Now, when we first announce a major change, we go through what's called a period of uninformed certainty. This is where I'm totally optimistic that I've made the right choice. And the example I use to describe positive change, and you can translate it into your organizational experience, the example I'm used to try and describe positive change is marriage. Now, marriage is a change that most of us think of as positive, at least to start with. Now, marriage is an important change for most of us. It's something we only do 2 or 3 times in our lives. We arrive on our marriage based on a well-scrubbed set of Saturday nights. We believe her hair actually looks like that, and she believes we'll continue to open the door for her. Now, when we first get married, we go through a period of happiness and wonder, joyfulness and light. We go through what's called the honeymoon period. This is essentially part of your relationship built on lack of data. Now, we don't call it the honeymoon period in the organizational example. We call it uninformed certainty. This is where I'm totally optimistic that this is the right thing. Now, as we increase our time frame across the horizontal axis, we increase our accumulation of data. Unfortunately, it's human nature to focus on the data that is disruptive to our expectation patterns, and resistance is generated from that disruption. So in our example, we find she squeezes the toothpaste tube in the middle. Her mother comes for dinner every Wednesday night. He leaves the toilet seat up in the middle of the night. Whatever, those aren't her teeth. It's at this point we're starting to wonder about truth in advertising, and we hit the informed doubt phase. That means we have steepened down the curve, and we're now doubting that this thing is ever going to achieve what it was supposed to achieve. Now, we can actually get people checking out from supporting the change, both overtly, I guess in our example they get a divorce, or covertly, and you've probably seen relationships where 2 people are still together. Now, if we're successful, but they don't interrelate anymore. Now, if we're successful in dealing with some of the resistance, we get over to a place where hope returns. This is not to name my wife, this is an emotion. We now have enough time frame in that we can more accurately assess the pros and cons, what's good and bad about the change. And then we get up into satisfaction and confidence, but the picture we've developed at stage 4 is a very different one than the picture we developed at stage 1. So even though we'd like to treat change as an event, it never occurs as an event in people's minds. It always goes through this adaptation period that happens in the organization. Now, we can never avoid this model, but what we want to do is reduce its amplitude and its duration, because that resistance bar in the middle is expensive. That costs. Managing resistance is a resource-consuming activity. And 2 consistent mistakes we'll make at the front end of this model, and that is we will oversell the benefits of the change and undersell the difficulty in implementation. Now, by overselling the benefits or underselling how difficult it's going to be to implement, you're actually increasing the resistance in the organization. Why? Because you're creating expectation patterns that will not be immediately realized. So I know it sounds funny from a classic sales perspective, but right up at the front of the change, we must be talking about what are all the potential downsides, what are all the curveballs that this thing could throw us, what are all the strange and wondrous ways that people can interpret this, because there will be resistance. Even if we cannot figure out where it's going to come from, we have to have resources marshaled to be able to deal with resistance immediately. So some of the things we can deal with from communication, some cannot, but we need to be able to communicate in different ways. First of all, we have different target groups impacted. That means we must communicate in multiple languages and multiple frames of reference. One vehicle, one medium, one memo, one standards document is not enough. We have to communicate in multiple vehicles and multiple languages. Every organization has multiple languages, whether it be financial, legal, medical, physician, technical, engineering. Those are all different languages, so we cannot assume that one language will get to every target group. Second thing, it is much more important to make your communications cyclical and iterative in the organization than to craft these miraculous communication packages that I see people striving for. Many times I'll go into organizations and I'll say, what have you communicated yet? And they go, well, nothing, because we don't have the binder done or the folder or whatever. In the absence of information, people's fear of the transition state leads to such a wonderful sense of catastrophe that if we leave it blank, they will fill in the blanks with a far worse situation than the reality you're trying to create for them. So if you use a lot of FAQ sheets or Q&A sheets, have a way to cycle those. Answer the same questions different ways for different audiences. Cycle them over and over again. Because what you're really doing is communicating out and bringing the resistance back. It is a loop constantly in the organization. Now, the major mistake we'll find with communication that people will make is many times we'll send out communications that are so bland, so vanilla, as to not generate any resistance. That is the antithesis of what you're trying to do. Your communication should be designed to bring honest, transparent information out to the organization and bring their reactions back. So the feedback loops are essential. All communications should be evaluated as to their effectiveness, down to the individual communications, both from a content, what you're saying, and how you're saying it. So we're going to use multiple vehicles, multiple mediums to communicate, and we're going to emphasize as much as possible face-to-face communication from sponsors. We want sponsors out there expressing, modeling, and reinforcing their commitment. Who's the most important sponsor to me as a target of the change? That person who controls my reinforcement. So that means the person I want to hear communicating about the change the most is my manager, my person that controls my reinforcement. We can talk about reinforcement, and we're going to run out of time today to get in depth to it, but you can take all the stuff I've talked about change for years and distill it down to some pretty simple formulas. If we want people to change, the motivation to change must be stronger than the motivation to stay put. So the motivation to be leaving where we are must be stronger than the motivation to stay where we are. And that motivation could be an opportunity for the individual, meet some personal need, reduce discomfort for them, or eliminate pain for them. And it doesn't have to be the same strength for everyone, but we've got to create the motivation to change. And the motivation must go past the intellectual. So if you don't change the reinforcements, you won't get the behavior. So when we're talking reinforcement, make sure we're qualifying our language here, make sure we're of the same, using the same definitions. When I'm talking reinforcement, I'm not talking about pay and compensation or performance appraisal. I'm talking about formal and informal, daily and long-term, tangible and intangible reinforcers between managers and direct reports. We want the reinforcement matched specifically to the new behavior. That means much of the reinforcement leverage we're going to use in our organizations is going to be more on the informal side than the formal side. The informal is easier to match to the new behavior. So I want to just come back and summarize 5 key points to achieve benefit realization for projects based on what we've said. Installation is not the same as implementation. That means the key to your successful project goes all the way back to the start based on the 5 dimensions of success. The second thing is sponsorship is the single most important factor ensuring successful implementation. but we're not saying any one sponsor is the single most important factor. We're saying this cascading network of expressed, modeled, and reinforced commitment, level by management level down the organization, is the key to implementation success, and in fact, key to implementation speed. Sponsorship is an extremely active condition. It is visible. Sponsorship is action and position. That means we should be able to see it in the organization. Resistance is inevitable, and you have to manage it. And there are all kinds of tactics, including involvement to manage resistance, but you can't make it go away, it's going to be there whether you want it to be there or not. And the most important one, besides sponsorship, is if you don't change the reinforcements, you won't get the change. And I'm not just talking about formal reinforcers like pay and comp or performance evaluation. I'm talking about the daily application of rewards and negative consequences between managers and direct reports. What we're trying to leverage is the shortest power distance in the organization, and that shortest power distance is where the reinforcement is controlled. That is the relationship that controls the speed of implementation. So I've given you a lot in a very short amount of time. I thought I'd stop at this point and just see if we have any questions.
Yeah, so Don, thank you so much. You have covered a lot. Just as a reminder, here's how, if you need to get in touch with Don, the best way is through me, and here's my contact information. I also just want to remind people, because I've gotten some notes asking about the slide deck and about the recording for this session, and again, you will get those if you registered for the session. So we'll be sending those out to you. Look for them in your email. So Don, I do want to get to questions. We have just some really great ones, and I think they get into some of the more complicated and messy aspects of implementation. So how do you keep individuals, here's the first question, it's from Kathleen. She asks, how do you keep individuals motivated during significant change, even when, and especially when they feel like they've seen this before? And I just want to say, I know that a lot of people are in situations where they have to go out and relaunch. So, Don, can you give some advice and counsel around that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, just to come back to the basic tenet that every time we see a pattern of behavior replicated over and over again, somewhere there is or was a reward for that behavior, we actually teach people to reinforce in our or to resist in our organizations. So we teach people to resist. So when people have an attitude that says, I've seen this before, it isn't going to happen, we've taught them that's the appropriate response. So it's not their issue, it's our issue. So the second thing is, to be able to deal with that, we're going to have to step up the level of immediate positive reinforcement, both positive and negative, and that should be in a ratio of about 4 to 1. 4 positives for attempting or achieving things, as opposed to penalty for making a mistake or punishment for failure. That reinforcement must be tied to the specific behavior. We teach people to resist the changes because we don't have immediate reinforcement for them in the organization. So it's a big question, but basically we have to increase both the systemic reinforcement and the individual reinforcement. The motivation to leave has got to be stronger than the motivation to stay. The scenario happens that you're talking about, Paula, for most people when all we have around the change is the expressed in organizations and not the modeled and reinforced from sponsors. So if sponsors control the reinforcement, ergo they control the pace, ergo we have to increase the discipline around cascading sponsorship in the organization, level by management level, to make sure that the reinforcement is being applied. It's almost impossible to ignore or avoid the change in the face of reinforcement.
So Don, thanks for that. Now Tanya wants to know, how do you deliver, she's in a situation, how do you deliver change when you've got these heavily embedded political rifts in upper management? And I don't think Tanya's alone, so can you address that?
Well,
it's a tough one.
Yeah, so any turf guarding problem, any political, so first of all, my definition of politics is just different preferred futures. That's all organizations are political. Now, organizations will become more political, less commitment there is to a long-term strategic direction in the organization, because there's more latitude. We have to manage lobby for our individual organizations' preferred futures. So that's a natural. So when we're dealing with all this political nightmare at the top of the organization, I don't want you out there to try and attempt to deal with this some sort of cultural ethos. The best way is to deal with this is by project. You can start to break down the turf in your organization, the political nature of the organization, by creating alignment on a specific project. So in order to do that, we have to have alignment between sponsors on strategic intent, what we're doing, strategic priority, how important it is, and we have to have alignment around the interdependence, meaning they can't succeed without each other, and what are their roles in achieving that success. Without that alignment created at the front end, the most of your life will be spent running up and down Mahogany Road trying to get these people to line up. So the first steps have to be in creating that alignment before you start to move the change through the organization. And it's much easier to do that on a project basis than a generic basis. So create alignment on strategic intent, what we're doing, and by trapping people in rooms together, I mean, so we get the sponsors in a room and get them aligned on intent, how important it is. It can't be priority 1 for one of them and priority 9 for another because it'll never happen, and understanding the interdependence between them. If we can't get that alignment, then we essentially now have to confront that lack of alignment and be able to say to executives, look, I'm getting mixed messages. I can't proceed until we've got these agreements and these alignments in the organization. Otherwise, we'll never get this done.
Thanks, Don. So Jessica has another question, and I think for, when we talk about complex changes, so many of these are multi-year programs. And, the challenge is, and the question is, how do you sustain this kind of sponsorship in a multi-year program? Do you have some advice about that?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're working on a 2 or 3 year global ERP implementation, for example, one of the major things we have to plan for is sponsor succession. So the sponsors who started it are probably not going to be sponsors who finish it. So 2 things with this. We have to plan for sponsor succession. So what do we do when reinforcing sponsors change in and out of the organization? What's our plan for when an authorizing sponsor changes in and out of the organization? How do we get them back on board and realize that we're going to have to map that all the way through the course of the implementation? But don't forget the sponsors change psychologically, because one of the problems with the sponsors is the nasty little beggars move around on you. So if they're really good sponsors, they move up the organization, and if they're really bad sponsors, we typically leave them there, and they require even more management. But sponsors also move psychologically. So when we went back, if you think about that positive change curve that we looked at, realize that that's maybe important to think about how the targets of change react, but it's infinitely more important for us to think about how the sponsors of change react, because they go through this model as well. So launch is the easy part of sponsorship. When do you need sponsorship the most? When it's when it's down in the weeds, that's when you're going to need sponsorship the most. When it's in the bottom of that trough, and we need to give sponsors predictability for that. So we need to be able to tell them this is the easiest part of sponsors, being a sponsor. 6 months from now, it's going to be messy. I'm going to need you the most. So this is a very complex question, but short answer to a complex question. Number 1, in any major implementation, we need to plan for sponsor succession as a project team and get the discipline around that. And number 2, realizing that sponsors, the journey from being a target of the change to sponsor is not a permanent journey. That is a journey that has to be sustained and maintained. So sponsorship typically will drop off in the organization as the disruptions come closer and closer to home. So all sponsor problems can be traced to poor contracting. We need to be able to give our sponsors some predictability from when we're going to need them most. But this, Paula, is a huge question, and that's just kind of foreshadowing a much more complicated answer.
I know. So Shaven wants to know, when you come into an organization, what's the starting point? Where do you start in any huge-scale change initiative? What should people do?
Well, let's take a couple different scenarios, Paula, and you and I both know that we would love to tell everybody that everything we do is planful, that it's all people call us up to say, Don, oh, Don, we're going to do a change 12 months from now. Please, oh, please come over and help us plan it out. But for the audience out there to realize that probably my organization's work 30 to 40% still to this day is remedial, meaning somebody started a change and screwed it up, and we have to go over in there and fix it. So the first place we need to start, we're going to start with the first basic step we have to do is we have to confirm the definition of successful change. I guarantee that most of your changes will be in jeopardy right from the get-go because they haven't defined the change by those 5 success dimensions. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'm going to change that I'm going to start to work on is sponsorship. So if sponsorship is the single most important factor in ensuring successful sponsors, I need to understand where my sponsors are, what quality of sponsorship I have, what quality of sponsorship do I need to get, and how to build the sponsorship in the organization. So I do a process called key role mapping to understand where all the sponsors live. And the third thing that's going to have the most impact is I have to check the reinforcement. How have the goals and objectives been reinforced? How is the behaviors being reinforced? And so typically when I come into an organization for a change that's already running, I will do I'll check the definition of the change. I'll do a key role map to figure where the sponsors are. I might do what we call a risk forecast to understand where the project is currently and what the current risks are, because I need to be able to target my energies to have more impact in less time. But the place to start is always around the foundation, and that's the definition of the change, followed by the sponsorship.
All right, and Don, I think we have time for one more quick question. I don't know if it's quick or not, but we'll try. Rachel wants to know, what are the differences, because in so many of our clients, they're global organizations, they don't always have the luxury of being together. What are the key differences when you've got a virtual team?
Well, I'm not so much worried about virtual teams as I am about virtual sponsors. First of all, the virtual teams, there's technology ways now. I still need to see people and look in their face and kind of things like that. So if you use virtual office or virtual meeting or those kind of things, you can get almost as much quality face time as you can face-to-face. You can't sense as much, but you'll get the visibility. So there is a significant challenge with distributed teams. And the thing to realize is the more distributed the team, the higher the need for interaction, the higher the need for discipline around how the team process works. So otherwise, you'll just waste time having pointless norms of behavior, a decision-making process, a conflict management process, an escalation process. All those things must be defined at the front end for how we're going to operate in this virtual environment. So some of the things we take for granted in real, tangible workplace teams, though that discipline is even more critical with virtual teams because we have to speed up the process.
Yeah, so I think, Don, we're out of time. We're certainly not out of questions. There's a lot of them, and you've addressed so many things today that I think are useful for people. I want to thank everybody for their participation, and hope you all have a good day, and we look forward to having you join us on our next webinar. So thanks, everybody. Bye now.